Soon after, Miserian curtsied before the emperor, spreading the skirt of her luxurious purple gown as she greeted him. His Majesty courteously apologized for the sudden summons, inquiring whether it had caused any inconvenience. Alice assured him that a summons from the emperor could never be a burden, and that she was only pleased to comply, omitting any mention of the rushed and difficult preparations for her journey to the palace. His Highness noted her eloquence and got straight to the point: her coming-of-age ceremony, which he intended to hold in the palace. This decision was likely driven by his desire to quash rumors, suggesting that the prince was neglecting his fiancée in favor of a commoner, thereby damaging both his reputation and that of Marquis Miserian. The Marquis, tense and bewildered, questioned the servants to find out whether the emperor was aware of this situation. When one of them hesitated, Alice's father silently clenched his fists, his anger reaching a boiling point. After all, the marriage was meant to be a critical political move, uniting the emperor's forces with the aristocracy. It was essential to convince the public that the union was fully legitimate, which made holding a ceremonial display at the palace a necessary step. However, the lady chose to see it as a gift, warmly thanking His Majesty on behalf of her entire family for such an honor. There was no point in arguing, his word was law. The emperor then inquired of the future empress about Helen, the daughter of Alecto, the nanny. All Miserian could say was that they used to play dolls together with Knight Kaihar and the prince. Pondering this, His Majesty emphasized that the future empress had made a mistake by allowing Count Enteblome's wife to appear at the palace, condemning her actions. Despite his ostentatious care for his grandson, the emperor was a tyrant who had personally killed his own son and sentenced the first prince to execution for an unproven rebellion. The empress, accused of the same offenses, survived only because she was carrying the current prince. Having just lost her first son, she found a nanny for the second in a situation similar to her own. His Highness asked with interest whether Alice was jealous of Helen, to which she gave a negative response, one that the emperor approved. After all, he said, there was nothing to be concerned about. He requested Miserian to come closer to him. Alice complied and knelt before him. Taking her hand in his, he told her that love is fleeting and far less important than the position and power one can gain from another. He continued to reassure her that everything would be fine, thanks to their agreement with her father, and that Alice had no reason to worry since her destiny was to become the prince's wife and the future empress, something no one could change or interfere with. This, he emphasized, would lead to the rise of her family's power, to the presence of her people in the palace, and to the boundless authority her son would wield in the future. He asked whether Miserian fully understood the meaning of his words, which at first seemed comforting, but in reality carried a significant threat: the absolute necessity for her, and no one else, to become the crown prince's wife. Alice agreed with his words, effectively signing her death warrant, with no option to refuse or retract them. The emperor took note of this. However, the foreigner harbored deep doubts about fulfilling his conditions. For the most part, she cared little for either death or the Miserian family. Perhaps she should visit her fiancé before her departure to avoid future complications. But Alice decided that today was not the best day for that, and that it would be better to focus her attention on Hybris. Besides, after enduring her grandfather's long lecture about the wedding, her patience was wearing thin, and if the prince were to say something foolish, it would be exceedingly difficult for her to maintain her composure. Suddenly, someone grabbed her by the shoulder, causing Alice to instinctively recoil and push the potential threat away as she turned to face it. With a startled cry, she demanded to know who it was, only to see Helen on the ground, letting out a small gasp. In surprise, Miserian remarked that Lady Entoblom had frightened her and reminded her that running in the palace was forbidden. The commoner hastily explained that she had only wanted to greet her in this way, to which Alice responded somewhat curtly, pointing out that she could have simply called out instead of behaving like a child. Helen stammered nervously that Alec liked it when she did so, greatly disappointing Alice with her childish behavior. Noticing Helen's hand, which she had injured during the fall, Alice softened and extended a hand to help her up. Entoblom waved off the injury, saying the palace physician would patch her up. Surprising the foreigner greatly, would a doctor of the imperial family attend to a commoner? But when Helen mentioned that the physician treated her well, Alice realized there was no need to worry, except perhaps about being punished for causing injury to the prince's truly beloved girl. This deeply irritated and angered the Marquise's daughter, so she tried to leave, stating that she was furious and that Helen annoyed her. When Helen attempted to apologize, Miserian once again noted her lack of formality and asked Entoblom to consider that, despite her status as a commoner, the future empress addressed her tactfully. She could very well address her as a maid or servant, someone unworthy of even a glance, but she refrained from doing so only because of the prince and emperor's fondness for her, nothing more. Helen wanted to protest, to remind Alice that they were friends, but the reader knew what was in the heroine's mind. Her memories held only Alecto and Iason. There was no mention of Alice, confirming the lack of a genuine friendship between them, unless one counted the possibility of Miserian being included solely to serve as an antagonist. In that case, the Marquis's daughter declared that it would be better if they didn't try to be friends at all, leaving the commoner confused. Alice bluntly stated that she had no desire to be Entoblom's friend, and such a possibility was ruled out from the very beginning due to their respective origins. Helen suggested that these words stemmed from her relationship with the prince. This greatly disappointed the foreigner. How could anyone assume she was jealous or saying such things because of some man she couldn't care less about? Despite Entoblom's beauty, it didn't mean she could be allowed to do whatever she pleased. Alice, reiterating that there was no reason for them to be friends, once again asked her to stop trying, but suddenly her hand was seized again. A familiar, irritating voice rang out, commenting that she was as insufferable as ever, or, to be more precise, getting even worse. Miserian, pressing her lips together, greeted Alecto, and reminded him about proper etiquette and morals. The prince, however, snapped back, accusing her of flaunting her status before him. His fiancée asserted her right to do so, as his betrothed. Alecto angrily retorted that it was merely an engagement, not something irrevocable or binding, and reminded her that she wasn't the only candidate. But Alice countered by questioning whether the emperor would agree with that sentiment. She pulled her hand away, and the prince smirked, remarking that she already seemed to fancy herself his wife, bowing before the emperor to earn his favor, as if that was all she was capable of. Helen took his hand, trying to calm him down and take the blame upon herself. Only then did he notice the scratches on her hands, no longer paying attention to her explanations that Miserian had merely been reminding her of proper etiquette. He asked the fateful question, who dared to injure Helen? Entoblom tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing, but suddenly a shout came from behind, calling the Marquise's daughter by her full name. A maid, the one who had originally summoned Alecto, claimed she had seen his fiancé push the commoner. The foreigner narrowed her eyes, wondering why the maid hadn't mentioned that Helen had startled her in the first place, but it no longer mattered. Alecto approached Entoblom's offender, despite Helen's desperate attempts to stop him. Miserian's vision blurred as a sharp slap landed on her cheek, leaving a stinging mark and muffling her hearing. Helen covered her mouth in horror. Alice, her hands trembling, pressed her palm against her burning cheek, unable to believe what had just happened. The prince, his hand still raised, declared that now things were even, weren't they? She had hurt someone who belonged to him, so he hurt her in return. His eyes reflected nothing but coldness, hatred, and disdain toward her. After the prince's words about fairness, Alice, rubbing her sore cheek, thought to herself that in that case it would have been much more just to ask Helen to hit her. The reader remembered this scene from the very book, and even when first meeting her, there was confusion about the existence of such psychopaths. But now, having experienced his actions firsthand, one could confidently say that the crown prince was nothing but a bastard. Regaining her composure and pulling her hand away from her burning cheek, she briefly considered striking the bastard back, just as he had struck her, but the only thing stopping her was the possible prospect of ending up in prison and never returning. Therefore, she had to continue behaving like Alice. Alecto had already intended to lead the frightened Helen away, but his fiancée sharply reminded him of the agreement between the emperor and her family, once again drawing his cold gaze toward her. She calmly declared that her marriage was not with him, but with the palace, and that his desires were not a priority, nor were her own. The girl showed the assertiveness and pride that, in her opinion, were characteristic of the daughter of Marquis Miserian. The crown prince raised an eyebrow and mockingly asked again, "After all, if you recall her words about love, the situation becomes quite interesting. Wasn't that her true intention?" For a moment, the girl was taken aback. What had Alice not done to fulfill her duty? Was any of it even a bit true? At the end of the novel, Helen confidently stated that Lady Miserian did not feel love for Alecto, but she could not speak the truth for sure, not truly knowing her, just like the reader. Therefore, if her words were not a lie, it was necessary to protect the true feelings of Alice. Without changing her expression, she sharply declared that, after his behavior, no trace of her love remained, surprising her fiancé and possibly making him feel a slight sting of his great guilt, reminding him that the wedding was not their choice, but a necessity dictated by their father's will. She declared that if he truly wished to break the bond, he should not direct his anger at his fiancée, but instead fall to his knees and beg the emperor for great mercy, though perhaps he didn't even need to make that decision. After the commotion Alecto caused, the emperor would soon find out everything. Meeting the crown prince's irritated gaze and seeing that he had nothing to say in response, Miserian proudly lifted her chin and walked away, leaving her fiancé and Helen in confusion, watching her retreat. Leaving the opulent palace behind, Alice descended the stairs to meet her guard, who noticed the flushed cheek of his mistress. Before any question could be asked, she ordered to be taken home, but it turned out that Kadar was already in the carriage. Miserian rolled her eyes at the exhaustion of their company, but still climbed into the carriage with the young man, who greeted her, but he faltered halfway through his sentence. Alice warned him not to ask about her cheek, as it was none of his business, to which the young man immediately gave in. When asked why he was there, he shrugged, explaining that Duke Kadar had sent him to clarify some matters with Marquis Miserian regarding the upcoming knight investiture, and he was the only free person at the estate. Taking advantage of the opportunity, he borrowed a spot in the lady's carriage. After all the time spent traveling, he was tired of the horses. When asked in confusion why not request a carriage from the palace, the knight winked slyly, saying that they didn't have such beautiful ladies. Alice didn't react to his words, though she noted that the knight mercenary certainly had a sharp tongue. The young lady politely inquired if there were any upcoming travels, but Jason didn't know. After dealing with Mother Nature and the dragon, he wanted to stay home for a while, in the capital. After such events, some dragons hated him, and he would prefer to lay low for a while, in safety. Although the book emphasized that his return was driven by a desire to see Helena, in reality, it seemed there were more reasons. Due to the High Priest's prophecies about the Dragon Slayer, since childhood, he had been subjected to harsh training as the future hero of the Kadar lineage, which had produced the best generals. The novel began with Jason's return to the palace, but of course for his love, the main heroine, a childhood friend who saw not the shield and sword, but Jason himself. The contrast in how they both viewed him sparked love in the heart of the tortured young man. Perhaps he was that character introduced merely as an obstacle in the relationship between Alec and Helena, but it seems there's a separate reason why he's a dragon slayer. Alice turned to the knight, with a request to tell her more about himself, while there was still time before they reached the estate. Jason was surprised by the girl's interest in his story, but to his delight, Lady Miserian dismissed it, claiming she was only avoiding his own questions about her. Saying that the reason wasn't all that important, he crossed his arms, pondering where to begin his tale. Quickly skipping over the prophecy given to him at birth about the Dragon Slayer, since that was well known far beyond the Empire, Jason began speaking of the brutal training he endured from the earliest days of his childhood, of the sword in his hands from his very first steps, the absence of even the slightest rest, how he sometimes blamed his parents, but ultimately came to the conclusion that it was all done for his own protection. However, the exhausted child could not have known that, and so he often thought that perhaps it would have been better if he had simply disappeared. Jason, like everyone in the Empire, knew his destiny to slay the dragon, but when exactly that would happen was anyone's guess. They sense a threat from those who have received the prophecy, so it would make sense if they came to where the Dragon Slayer is and attacked. This meant the Kajar family estate could be at risk, something young Jason could not allow, and to avoid the danger, he began to wander. Even if it was to gain strength, there are now doubts that there wasn't another reason for it. For the young man, with his complicated fate sitting by the crackling fire, often wondered if death might be a relatively good outcome. The only light in his eyes burned when he remembered Helen, the only one who showed him care. Even if now everything had returned to where it once was, his feelings, and the knight himself, so much had changed because of the many different people he met during his travels. But there was one meeting that stood out as the brightest and most important. Through the crowd, casting a glance out the window of the carriage, at the fair-haired, beautiful princess of the neighboring country. Although no, it wasn't her. Alice raised an eyebrow in disbelief, realizing that this ladies' man was lying to her again, and asked how much of it was true. Jason proudly declared that rumors about them had even reached the capital, to which the lady chastised him, saying he had done it on purpose, stirring up a commotion. The knight blushed slightly and dropped the subject, and now, with seriousness, he stated that his best meeting had been with the dragon itself. Like something from a fairy tale, Jason crossed mountains, swamps, rivers, and fields before encountering it, so vast and majestic that one begins to doubt if anything or anyone could be as enormous. If his words were to be believed, the knight's view of everything was even grander due to his sense of duty and fear, especially of his fate. He gripped his sword tighter in his hands, showing his resolve and desires to live, to escape, discontent with what was happening and the fate assigned to him. All the discomfort came only after facing the dragon head-on. Maybe it was because of the sense of imminent death, for even in a fair fight, it seemed unlikely he could return to normal afterward. However, this encounter happened in a way entirely different from what young Kajar had expected. The dragon greeted Jason, glad that he had finally come, though, compared to the entirety of its long life, the wait was but a moment. It felt like an eternity. To the surprised question about the dragon's knowledge, it declared that the revelation was not given by God, but by itself. Manipulating the priest, it had condemned itself to death at the hands of Kajar. The life of the young man, on the other hand, was merely a sacrifice, the whim of fate. For its own death, it had broken all the laws of cause and effect. The most powerful creature, created by nature, had tricked it. But of course, it paid the price for its crime. Suddenly, it burst into a brilliant flash of light, and before the dragon slayer's eyes, its form, along with the fear of it, disappeared, leaving behind only the heart that needed to be cleaved. Without hesitation, Jason stepped forward, gripping his sword tighter, and raising it high, he plunged it into the glowing white heart, which burst forth with white blood and exploded with a loud crash. Afterward, everything shook, even the very core of the earth, and the young Kajar had his life restored. Alice listened carefully to the knight's story, but she still couldn't understand his feelings. What intrigued her most was the fact that the dragon had manipulated the high priest, and the breaking of the laws of cause and effect, which should have prevented such a crime. Was it possible that the reader would need to resort to the same method? Could his tale become her guiding thread? She asked if anything was known about the high priest, and what the supreme being meant by the laws, and Kajar mentioned the name Mateus, but noted that he had long since grown old and returned to his homeland, and that Jason too knew nothing of the world's laws. The dragon had only answered his question in vague terms, offering no specifics even about the dragon slayer's fate. However, given its knowledge and experience, it was unlikely that an ordinary mortal could comprehend the truth, even if it were spoken aloud. So, once again, there was nothing useful for the reader, and further questioning might raise suspicions, so she decided to find the rest out on her own, pretending that her interest had already been satisfied. Suddenly, the knight spoke of a surprising closeness that had appeared, drawing a puzzled glance from Lady Miserian. He gently reproached Alice for her coldness, and convincingly asked her to reconsider her attitude toward him, piercing her with his gaze, yet not changing his polite smile when addressing her. Such behavior from the lady's man-knight was bound to surprise the young woman. With his love for Helen, he dares to flirt with Alice herself, whom he could barely even call a friend. Coldly smiling, she corrected Jason, emphasizing that the closeness was far too small for a relationship of such a kind as between the inferior and the superior. This upset the knight, and he began to resemble a puppy that had been scolded, but it had no effect on Alice. After all, he wasn't a real dog. The carriage stopped in front of the palace, the windows reflecting the amber hue of the setting sun. Stepping down first, the knight extended his hand to the lady, offering assistance to the young woman, who, after a few seconds of hesitation, reached out her palm. The young man suddenly turned to Lady Miserian with a request, not to be angry with such inexperienced people, who hardly ever leave the grounds of the imperial palace. Alice sharply retorted that such circumstances didn't absolve one from responsibility, and yanked her hand from his grip, then warned Kajar that her father was in his study, and politely bid him farewell, bowing her head and lifting her skirt, wishing him well in his affairs. Resigning himself to what had happened, the knight also bowed, placing his hand on his heart, concluding their meeting. The maid, with a look of fear, noticed the lady's swollen cheek, and even the excuses that everything was fine did little to reassure her. A minute later, she was already holding a cool compress, gently pressing it to the swelling on the lady's face in an attempt to hide it before dinner with the Marquis. Alice asked again about dinner, and the maid pointed out that they hadn't dined together in a while. It wasn't difficult for the reader to play the role of Lady Miserian, but meeting the Marquis, her new father, was quite uncomfortable. The table was quiet, only the crackling of the fire and the clinking of silverware against plates could be heard. As Alice stole a glance at the Marquis, who was calmly eating his meal. But then, suddenly, he turned to her, causing her to flinch. He asked her to confirm the truth of her intentions not to appoint a personal knight, to which the young woman replied that she would be fine with just regular soldiers and guards to accompany her. However, her father insisted on a visit to the investiture, unless she had a special reason for refusal. He pointed out that many people, not of noble birth, become knights for their careers, but due to their origins, they face significant restrictions that prevent them from being prioritized in the selection process. For the sake of good relations, many choose warriors from influential families, who value only their own lives and their own secrets, no one else's. There are even cases where knights hold a higher status than their lord, and the lord indulges them, despite the contradictions with the knight's direct duties. Her father began listing the main advantages of having a knight: the ability to send him to places she couldn't go herself, to command him to do what couldn't be trusted to anyone else, and be sure that no one would ever know of it, to have a person who, in case of need, would give their life for hers. The knight's primary duties made Alice flinch. The Eris Miserian, who was skilled in manipulation, would undoubtedly find such an opportunity useful, so this excellent proposal could only come from her father, who knew his daughter well. For a moment, it even seemed as if he weren't speaking to her, not to his own daughter, but to the reader, who had found herself in her body. She couldn't be entirely like the real Alice in everything. Her habits, her preferences, her tastes, everything had suddenly changed. Her father, who lived with her and loved her, couldn't help but notice the contrast and guess that something was wrong. Suddenly, a foolish thought crossed her mind: to apologize for the accidental kidnapping of his daughter's body, but thoughts about the risks of being thrown out filled her head. Would he try to find out anything about his real daughter, or would he call her a witch and torture her? That was far more terrifying than the risk of being exposed by High Priest Hybris. Perhaps it was because of the sense of duty for the lost, beloved member of his family. The young woman became so lost in her thoughts that she didn't even notice the Marquis standing up and approaching her, gazing at her thoughtfully, and it was only the gentle pat of her father's hand on her shoulder that brought her out of her trance. Such a light, fleeting touch just before his departure from the room, but, unexpectedly, it was so significant for the reader. Lowering her head, she quietly whispered with only her lips how much she missed her real father, and her mind swirled with various thoughts about what had happened to the real her. Was she alive or dead? Had she disappeared? Were her parents looking for her? Would they ever find and see their daughter again? Overcome with emotions, she buried her face in her hands, admitting to herself just how scared she was and how badly she wanted to go back. Unnoticed, the maid watched from behind the curtain, wondering what was happening to her dear lady.